The night was oppressive. A thick fog hung over the small, isolated town of Willow Creek, a place where the world seemed to stand still. The trees, heavy with moisture, loomed like dark sentinels around the perimeter, while the only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant creak of old wooden structures. This was a town forgotten by time, and that suited Noah just fine. He had come here to escape, to get away from the noise of the city and the overwhelming stress of his life. But he hadn't expected the quiet to be so unsettling. Noah's cabin was small, tucked away at the edge of the forest. He liked it that way. It gave him peace, a rare commodity in his line of work. He was a private investigator, but not the kind you'd read about in books. His cases were often mundane, involving cheating spouses or missing persons who were found in days. But this time, his visit to Willow Creek was purely personal. His brother had gone missing a few weeks ago, vanishing without a trace. The authorities had written it off as another case of someone wanting to disappear, but Noah wasn't so sure. His brother had left behind strange notes, cryptic warnings that something watched him. Noah thought it was paranoia until the strange happenings began. It started with the drones. At first, he thought they were just a local hobbyist's fascination with flying cameras. But they appeared every night, hovering just above the tree line, the soft, buzzing, faint but constant. They were always far enough away not to be a direct threat, but close enough to make him feel uneasy. Noah tried to dismiss it, attributing it to the quiet of the town and his own overactive imagination. But something about the drones felt wrong, like they were observing him, studying him. Then came the lights. It wasn't just one or two, but clusters of them, high up in the sky, their eerie glow casting an unnatural pallor over the land. At first he thought they were just some kind of strange weather phenomenon, or even a trick of the light. But each night, they grew more numerous, more organized. They moved in patterns, almost like they were trying to communicate. Noah's attempts to get a closer look were always thwarted by the dense trees surrounding his cabin. But he knew they were there. He could feel them, even when he wasn't looking. That night, as Noah sat by the fire in his cabin, trying to shake the dread creeping up his spine, the buzzing returned. Louder this time, closer. He stood up and moved to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see the drone, but he could hear it, the unmistakable whine of its rotors cutting through the fog. It hovered just beyond the tree line, its shadow stretching long across the ground. Noah grabbed his jacket and went outside, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. He had to know what was going on. The fog seemed thicker outside, wrapping around him like a heavy shroud. Noah squinted into the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of the drone. The buzzing grew louder, but still, he saw nothing. Then, without warning, the lights appeared again, this time much closer. They were almost blinding, a cluster of glowing orbs high above the trees. He took a step forward, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something kept him rooted to the spot. The lights pulsed in the sky, and he thought he saw something moving among them. "Who's there?" Noah called out, his voice cutting through the silence. There was no answer, only the sound of the drone's hum and the eerie, rhythmic flashing of the lights above. But then, through the fog, a figure appeared in the distance. At first it was just a shadow, indistinct and shifting. But as it came closer, Noah could make out the shape of a person, tall and thin, moving with an unnatural smoothness. The figure seemed to glide, not walk, and Noah's blood ran cold as a sense of dread washed over him. He should have turned and run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure in the fog drew closer. Its movements slow but deliberate, as if it were coming for him. Noah's heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the drone's hum. He instinctively took a step back, his body betraying him with a tremor that ran down his spine. The figure was tall, too tall, and its face, though obscured by the fog, felt wrong. Something about its shape seemed distorted, like it wasn't entirely human. Noah's breath caught in his throat as he fought the primal urge to run, knowing that doing so would only make him a target. The lights above flickered, casting odd shadows on the ground, making the figure's movements appear jerky and unnatural. Noah tried to focus, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The fog pressed in on him, the world around him shrinking as the eerie silence stretched longer, broken only by the persistent buzzing overhead. The drone was still there, watching, waiting. Noah didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in place, but when the figure reached the edge of his yard, it finally spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was soft but cold, with an unplaceable accent that sent a chill down his spine. It sounded almost mechanical, like it was being filtered through static. Noah's throat tightened, but he forced himself to respond. I'm just passing through, looking for someone." The figure tilted its head, an odd motion that reminded Noah of an owl. "Looking for someone? You won't find him here." It took a step closer, its feet barely making a sound as they met the wet ground. "There's no one left here to find." Noah shook his head, his mind racing. His brother had disappeared here, in Willow Creek. The authorities had found nothing, but Noah couldn't shake the feeling that the town was hiding something. That figure, whatever it was, knew more than it was letting on. "What do you mean?" Noah asked, his voice wavering slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. "I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him?" The figure's lips twitched, almost as if it were smiling. "Your brother is part of the town now, just like the rest of them." Noah's stomach turned at the words. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around him like a vice, suffocating in its intensity. He didn't know whether it was the fog or the figure itself that made him feel trapped, but his every instinct screamed that he needed to get away. Yet his feet remained planted firmly in the wet earth, unwilling to move. "Who are you?" Noah demanded, his voice growing more forceful. "What do you want?" The figure's head tilted again, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. It didn't answer immediately, its gaze shifting upward to the sky. The lights above flickered again, growing brighter, and Noah felt the air around him charged with a strange energy. He couldn't explain it, but the longer he stood there, the more he felt that the lights were alive, conscious, watching him. Suddenly, the drone above whined loudly, its buzzing increasing in volume. The figure turned its head toward it, and Noah followed its gaze. The drone hovered just above the tree line, its lights flashing erratically now. He could see it clearly. Its shape was angular, almost robotic in design, with sharp edges and glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the fog. It wasn't just a drone anymore, it felt like something far more dangerous. The figure turned back to Noah. "You should leave now," it said softly, its voice almost a whisper. "Before they notice you." Before Noah could respond, the figure's hand shot out, fast as lightning, grabbing him by the wrist with an unnatural strength. He gasped, his body instinctively pulling away, but the grip was unyielding. The lights above flashed in rapid succession, blinding him momentarily. He could hear the drone getting closer, the air thick with the hum of its rotors. He felt something in his chest tighten, as if the very air around him was pressing down. "Run," the figure hissed, its voice low and urgent. "Now." Without thinking, Noah yanked his arm free from the figure's grasp, stumbling back as the fog seemed to part before him. He ran, his legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. The lights flickered again, and the drone's buzzing grew louder, its presence now unmistakably behind him. Noah dared a quick glance over his shoulder, but all he saw were the faint glowing orbs in the sky, seemingly multiplying. The figure was gone, swallowed up by the fog, but the oppressive sense of being hunted remained. He didn't know how long he ran, but when he finally reached the cabin, the buzzing stopped. The air felt still again, as though nothing had happened. But Noah knew better. Something had changed. He slammed the door behind him, bolting it shut. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but the image of the figure, the lights, and the drone lingered in his mind, making it hard to think straight. Noah stumbled toward the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to peer outside. The fog was still thick, but he saw no sign of the figure, no sign of the lights or the drone. It was as if everything had vanished into thin air. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Whatever was happening in Willow Creek, whatever force was pulling at him, wasn't done yet. The following days passed in a blur for Noah. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him was slowly unraveling. The fog never seemed to lift, and the buzzing of drones became a constant in the background of his life. It was as if they were always there, watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He stayed holed up in his cabin, trying to gather his thoughts, But every time he looked out the window, he felt the unsettling presence of those glowing lights and the ever-looming threat of the drones. Noah had never believed in conspiracy theories, but the more he pieced together the strange events, the more he started to wonder. His brother's disappearance, the strange figure in the fog, the drones, the lights in the sky. Was there something more sinister going on in Willow Creek? Or was it all just a product of his paranoid mind? He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. The town held answers, but every time he thought about venturing out, a wave of dread washed over him. The town seemed deserted, but he knew there were people living there. People who might know something about the strange happenings. And yet, every time he thought about asking around, his mind screamed for him to stay away. The figure's words echoed in his head. There's no one left here to find. But Noah had come here for a reason. He couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to his brother. It was the only thing keeping him from spiraling into madness. He had to find out what the town was hiding, and he had to do it soon. That evening, as the sun began to set, Noah decided to take a risk. He grabbed his jacket and his flashlight, making sure the doors and windows of the cabin were locked before stepping outside. The fog was even thicker than before, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't see much beyond the dim glow of his flashlight, but he could hear the distant sound of the drone, always hovering, always watching. Noah moved quickly, following the road that led into the heart of the town. The houses were silent, their windows dark. He passed the small gas station, the old diner, and the abandoned general store, all devoid of life. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, left to decay. But Noah couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, out there in the shadows, watching him as he passed by. As he reached the center of town, he noticed a small building on the corner, its door slightly ajar. It was a library, of all places, dusty and forgotten, with a sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. Something about it called to him. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The air was stale, the smell of old books and mildew heavy in the air. The library was small, with rows of shelves lining the walls. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Noah moved deeper into the library, his footsteps muffled on the worn wooden floor. As he passed a row of shelves, something caught his eye, an old, leather-bound book lying on a table. He reached out to pick it up, dust falling from its pages as he flipped it open. The book was filled with strange symbols and cryptic writing, none of which made any sense to him. But as he turned the pages, he found something that made his blood run cold. A drawing, a detailed illustration of a figure that looked almost identical to the one he had seen in the fog. The creature in the image was tall, thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. Below the drawing was a name, The Watcher. There was a brief passage under the name, written in the same strange script as the rest of the book. Noah couldn't read it, but he could make out a few words that chilled him to the bone. Eyes, eternal, hunt. Suddenly, the sound of buzzing filled the room, louder than ever before. It was the drone, closer than ever. Noah's heart raced as he slammed the book shut and stuffed it into his jacket. He turned to leave, but the door to the library slammed shut on its own. Panic surged through him as he tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He could feel something on the other side, pressing against the door, as if something was waiting for him to make a move. The buzzing grew louder, more insistent. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness behind him. "You should not have come here." Noah whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the shadows, stretching unnaturally long across the floor. He took a step back, his mind racing. The voice, it wasn't human. It was cold, hollow, as if it had come from something deep within the earth itself. The lights outside flickered, casting a brief flash of illumination into the library, revealing that the walls were covered in the same strange symbols from the book. They were everywhere, etched into the wood, painted on the ceiling, carved into the floor. And then, as if summoned by the voice, the figure appeared. It was standing in the far corner of the room, its long, spindly limbs stretching out toward Noah with unnatural speed. Its eyes, glowing and eerie red, locked onto his. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was the Watcher. The thing that had been following him, studying him, waiting for him to find this place. Noah's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled backward. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking in fear. The watcher didn't answer. It only took a step forward, then another, its eyes never leaving his. The air in the library grew heavy, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around him. The lights above flickered again, casting long shadows over the creature's form. Noah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? Was he losing his mind? But one thing was clear: the watcher had found him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Noah's pulse pounded in his ears as the watcher took another step closer. His back pressed against the cold stone wall, but there was nowhere left to go. The room felt like it was shrinking, the oppressive atmosphere closing in on him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to escape, but his feet remained rooted to the spot, frozen by the intensity of the creature's gaze. Its glowing eyes were hypnotic, pulling him in as if it were searching for something inside him. Why? Why are you doing this?" Noah choked out, his throat tight with fear. "What do you want?" The watcher tilted its head, a movement so fluid it looked like something unnatural. Its voice came next, a whisper that seemed to echo from all around him, from deep within the walls. "We do not want. We take." The word sent a shiver down his spine. "We take." Noah didn't understand. Was this some kind of punishment? A ritual? His brother had been here, and he had left behind clues, warnings, but Noah had failed to understand them until now. He glanced quickly around the room. The book he'd found was still stuffed in his jacket, the pages seared into his memory. The watcher seemed to notice his glance, its head snapping toward the jacket, and Noah felt the pressure of its gaze intensify. It knew what he had seen. It knew that he understood, at least a part of it. The figure's hands began to extend toward him, its fingers long and twisted, curling like branches of a dead tree. With each movement, Noah felt his strength drain, as if the creature was drawing something from him. He could hear the sound of the drone now, not just buzzing in the distance, but nearby, its rotors whirring at a high pitch, the vibrations echoing through the floor. The lights outside flickered, then began to flash in rapid hypnotic bursts. Suddenly, as if sensing the shift, the watcher stopped. It paused, its head jerking toward the door. The buzzing of the drone intensified, a constant presence like a predator circling its prey. Noah's heart beat in his throat as a realization struck him. The drone, the lights, they weren't just watching him. They were part of it. The watcher was not alone. The lights, the drones, they were the eyes of something much larger, something that reached beyond the physical realm and into something darker, older, and far more terrifying. "Leave," the creature rasped. Its voice had deepened, a rumble now reverberating through the library. "You cannot belong here. You do not belong." Noah didn't wait to hear more. He turned and bolted toward the door, adrenaline coursing through him. He could hear the watcher behind him, the sound of its distorted limbs scraping against the walls, but he didn't look back. The door had been closed when he tried to leave before, but now it swung open with ease. He ran into the night, the fog swallowing him whole as the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. The drone was above him now, closer than it had ever been. He could see the faint red lights of its eyes cutting through the mist, and for a moment it almost seemed as though the drone itself was alive, a malicious intelligence pulsing through it. The sky above was a vast canvas of lights, some blinking, some steady, but all of them connected by something Noah couldn't understand. He stumbled forward, gasping for air, his lungs burning, but the drone seemed to follow him with relentless precision, its buzzing growing louder, almost deafening. Noah couldn't tell if it was an actual machine or something far more insidious. The lights flashed above him, blinding him, making it impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. The town, the fog, the trees, they all seemed to blend into one continuous blur. Noah's mind reeled. What was happening? What had he stumbled into? Why had his brother been so sure that Willow Creek was cursed? The thought of his brother, the cryptic warnings he had left behind, sent a new wave of horror rushing over him. He had to keep going, but he could feel the presence of the drone above, almost suffocating in its intensity. Suddenly, a sharp pain tore through Noah's chest. He gasped, his body jerking with the force of the sudden pressure, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his vision going dark at the edges. The drone's hum became a roar in his ears. He tried to crawl, to drag himself forward, but his limbs felt heavy, as if the fog itself was pulling him down. A figure appeared in front of him, standing tall against the oppressive fog, but this time it wasn't the Watcher. It was his brother, Mark. His brother, but not the way Noah remembered him. Mark's eyes were wide, glazed over, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, Noah could hear the voice of the Watcher in his mind. "He is ours now, just as you will be." Mark reached out, his hand hovering above Noah's head. His brother's touch was cold, the chill of death itself. With the last of his strength, Noah managed to push forward, to crawl away from the figure, but the world around him began to blur. The lights in the sky were flashing so rapidly now that they seemed to engulf him entirely. And then, nothing. Noah's vision blacked out completely. The next morning, the fog had lifted. Willow Creek was quiet, still, and undisturbed. The drone was gone. The lights in the sky were no more. But in the center of town, by the old library, a figure stood, tall and thin, with glowing red eyes, watching. And for the first time in a long while, it smiled. The small town of Whitestone had always been quiet, a place where everyone knew everyone else's name. The kind of place where nothing ever happened until it did. For years, people spoke in hushed whispers about the lights in the sky, the strange drones that would appear at night, floating silently just beyond the treetops. At first, it was easy to dismiss. They were just rumors after all. But then the sightings started happening more frequently, and things began to change in Whitestone. Maya was new to the town. She had moved to Whitestone just a few months ago, seeking a quiet life away from the bustle of the city. Her small cabin on the outskirts of town was surrounded by dense woods, which only seemed to add to the mysterious aura of the place. Maya had heard the stories, of course. Everyone who lived in Whitestone had, but she never thought much of them. She was too focused on her own life, settling in and starting fresh. That was until one night when she saw the lights herself. It was late, past midnight, and Maya was sitting on her porch, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot summer day. She glanced up at the sky, and there they were, two small, glowing orbs hovering silently above the trees. They weren't planes or helicopters, and they definitely weren't stars. Maya's heart raced. She had heard the stories about the drones, but this felt different. These lights were moving in ways that didn't make sense. They drifted, almost lazily, circling each other in a strange dance. For a moment, Maya thought about going inside, locking the door, and pretending she hadn't seen anything. But something in the air made her freeze. The lights didn't move like any natural phenomenon she knew. They were too deliberate, too coordinated. And then, as if they were aware she was watching, they shifted direction and began to move toward her. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't look away. The lights grew larger as they approached, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something behind them. Shapes in the sky, flickering like shadows, almost as if something was controlling them. Then, the lights abruptly vanished, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread in the air. Maya stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do. She considered calling someone, but who would believe her? It was just a few lights in the sky, right? But as she turned to go back inside, she heard it. The low hum, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It came from the trees, like the sound of a distant engine revving up. And then she saw it, a drone, hovering just above the ground near the edge of her property. The drone was silent, but it had an eerie presence. Its black metallic surface glinted in the moonlight, and its camera-like lens stared directly at her. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was as if the drone was studying her, waiting for something. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating through her chest. She finally forced herself to take a step back, then another. Slowly, she turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. Her heart pounded in her ears, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. She pressed her back against the door, trying to steady her racing thoughts. What was going on? Why was she the one to see it? Why her? The next morning, Maya tried to shake off the terror that had gripped her the night before. She had stayed awake long after the drone disappeared, staring at the darkened windows, half expecting it to return. But by dawn, the sky had been empty, and the small town of Whitestone seemed as tranquil as ever. Still, there was something off about the stillness. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. At the local diner, Maya sat down with a coffee and tried to engage with the town's residents, hoping for some normalcy. But as she listened to the chatter around her, the topic of the mysterious lights and drones seemed to be on everyone's mind. "Did you hear about the strange lights last night?" a woman at the counter asked, her voice low and filled with unease. "I swear, they were bigger than last time, and they moved in a way that didn't make any sense." Maya's stomach tightened. She had hoped the town's talk of drones and lights was just folklore, but now it seemed like the whole town was watching the sky. The woman next to her, a woman named Linda, continued, "They say there's something to it, that they're not just lights, that it's something else, something we can't explain." Maya opened her mouth to ask more but quickly closed it, not wanting to appear like she was the only one who hadn't been involved in the strange sightings. She pretended to sip her coffee, though it had gone cold. Her mind raced. Could what she had seen last night have been real? And if so, what did it mean? Across from her, a man named Thomas, a lifelong resident of Whitestone, leaned in with a grave expression. "People used to say the lights were harmless, that they were just military drones testing something, but I don't think it's that simple anymore." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You ever hear the rumors about the disappearances?" Maya's eyes widened. She had heard whispers, of course, everyone had. But disappearances? People had gone missing, but no one knew the details. The authorities were tight-lipped, and those who had vanished had simply been erased from the community's memory. Maya shook her head slowly, hoping to brush off the conversation. Thomas seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's been happening for years. No one talks about it, but every so often someone vanishes. No one sees a thing. But the lights, they've been around the same time, you know?" The hairs on the back of Maya's neck stood up. Her instinct told her not to press the matter, to let it go. But something in her wouldn't allow her to dismiss it. "And you think the drones, or the lights, have something to do with these disappearances?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, but I've been seeing something. Something in the sky, something more than lights. I think they're watching us." Maya's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what she feared. The possibility that whatever was happening was no longer just a rumor. It was real. She stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. "I need to go," she said quickly, her voice shaky. As she hurried out of the diner, Maya felt the weight of the conversation hang over her like a shadow. She tried to focus on the road as she made her way back to her cabin, but her mind kept drifting back to the lights and the drone. What did it mean? And why was it happening now? She had to find out more. But as she neared her cabin, a chill ran through her. The same eerie hum from the night before, quiet but unmistakable, was drifting through the trees again. This time, the sound was closer. Maya gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as the drone appeared on the horizon, just like the night before. But this time, there were more lights in the sky, and they were heading straight toward her. Maya slammed the brakes, her heart racing as the drone hovered just above the trees. The sky was filled with strange lights, too many to count, pulsating in eerie synchronization. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on her chest. Her mind screamed for her to drive away, to escape, but her body remained frozen, her eyes glued to the sky above. The hum grew louder, and now, it wasn't just a distant noise. It was all around her, vibrating the ground beneath her feet. Maya's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she watched in horror. The drones were closing in, and the lights above seemed to take on a life of their own. They began to form a circular pattern, orbiting in the sky as if they were part of some unearthly design. As the lights drew closer, Maya's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just sit there, not anymore. But where would she go? The town was too small. No one could help her. The authorities had always brushed off the drone sightings as nothing more than military experiments. But this was something else. Maya made a split-second decision. She threw the car in reverse, her tires screeching against the gravel as she backed down the road toward her cabin. She wasn't going to outrun whatever this was, but she could at least make it inside, lock the doors, and try to think clearly. Her cabin, isolated as it was, seemed like the only place she could still feel some semblance of safety. But as she turned onto the narrow path leading to her cabin, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There were more drones, dozens of them, all hovering above her property. They were silent, but the lights on them flashed in a chaotic rhythm, as if they were waiting, watching. Panic surged through Maya's chest as she stepped out of the car. "No," she whispered to herself. "This can't be happening." She sprinted toward the cabin, heart pounding in her ears, but when she reached the door, she hesitated. It was as if something were urging her not to go inside. A strange sense of unease filled her. The door creaked open, and Maya stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the unsettling stillness in the air. It was as if the whole cabin had been holding its breath. The temperature had dropped significantly, and her breath came out in small clouds as she moved through the rooms, flicking on every light. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the faint hum from outside grew louder, almost deafening. Maya slammed the door behind her and locked it. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. Something wasn't right. She didn't know what it was, but she felt it, an oppressive, malevolent force creeping closer. She hurried to the window, peeking out through the blinds. The drones were still there, floating in the distance, and their lights were brighter now, almost blinding. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Maya's blood ran cold. It was too early for anyone to be visiting, and it wasn't just a knock, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A faint voice whispered from the other side, "Maya, let us in." She froze. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. There was no way anyone could be outside her door, certainly not in the middle of this bizarre, terrifying event. But the voice persisted. It was soft but insistent. "Maya, let us in." Her breath hitched. She slowly backed away from the door, her mind reeling. She had to do something. She had to get out. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the knocking continued, each tap growing louder, more demanding. The voice outside, familiar yet distant, kept repeating her name, growing more urgent with each passing second. "Maya, let us in." She pressed her back against the wall, trying to control her breathing. The cabin felt too small, too suffocating. She had to make a decision. Her mind raced. The drones outside were still hovering, their lights flashing erratically, and that strange hum filled the air. The voice outside, though distorted and chilling, sounded almost as if it was coming from someone she knew. But Maya couldn't afford to let her guard down. She grabbed the nearest thing, an old, rusty fire poker, and held it in front of her as she tiptoed toward the door, her footsteps barely audible against the cold wooden floor. The knocking had stopped for a moment, and in the eerie silence, Maya's mind screamed at her to just leave. But where could she go? The drones were everywhere. The woods surrounded her cabin. There was no escape. Her hand reached for the door handle, but before she could turn it, a crackling sound erupted from the other side. The voice, now harsh and distorted, echoed louder than before. "You can't run, Maya. We're already here. We've always been here." Maya recoiled, her stomach churning. The door seemed to pulse with energy, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. She stepped back, eyes wide with fear. There was no one out there, she told herself. It was just a trick, some psychological manipulation, a way to make her doubt her own sanity. But deep down, she knew better. Something far more sinister was at play. In a moment of clarity, Maya made a decision. She would leave the cabin, get to the edge of the property, and try to find help. Her legs shook, but her resolve hardened. The door behind her trembled again, but she ignored it. She grabbed her jacket and dashed out the back door, sprinting toward the woods, away from the drones and the ominous voice. As she plunged into the darkness of the trees, the cold night air cut through her jacket, but she barely noticed. The hum was louder now, and the lights above her blinked erratically, as though they were closing in. She stumbled, her mind clouded with panic, but she kept moving forward. The drones were everywhere, above, around, and even beneath the trees. Her breath came in short gasps as she ran deeper into the forest, not daring to look back. She could hear the faint thrum of the drones, their presence following her like a shadow. Her feet caught on tree roots, but she pushed herself harder. Desperation setting in. She couldn't let them catch her. Whatever this was, whatever was happening, it wasn't just about the drones or the lights. It was something worse, something far darker. As she ran, the world around her seemed to warp. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now loomed like twisted, menacing figures. The lights above her flickered again, and for a brief moment she thought she saw something moving in the shadows, shapes that were too tall, too thin to be human. Her pulse quickened. She had to keep running. Then, out of nowhere, the lights above her seemed to converge, casting an intense beam directly at her. Maya stumbled, nearly falling as she felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure on her chest. It was as if the air had thickened, wrapping itself around her in a suffocating embrace. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she lost her bearings. She could hear the voice again, but this time it was all around her, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. It was ancient, foreign, and filled with a sense of cold malevolence. With one final, desperate effort, Maya broke through the pressure. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, but the hum and the lights didn't stop. They hovered above her, waiting, watching. The woods were silent once again, except for the rhythmic pulse of the lights, which now seemed to be vibrating through her very bones. Maya closed her eyes, trembling. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. She was no longer alone in the woods. And whatever was out there, it was not human. The small town of Eldridge had always been quiet, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick woods. Its streets were lined with homes that had stood for generations, their peeling paint and sagging porches the only signs of age. People kept to themselves, as they always had. But for Lena, who had just moved back to her childhood home after a decade away, there was something unnerving about the town. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an energy in the air, a weight that seemed to settle on the shoulders of everyone who lived there. It all started the day she saw the lights in the sky. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a trick of the eye. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and the sky had taken on an unnatural shade of violet. But then, from the corner of her vision, Lena noticed something that made her stop. Distant lights flickered in the sky, just beyond the tree line. The lights weren't stars, and they weren't planes. She could tell that much. They moved too erratically, darting across the sky in ways that defied logic. Lena thought she was imagining things, but when she mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Pembroke, the elderly woman's face paled. "You saw them too," she whispered. "I've been seeing them for years, and you're not the first to come asking about them." Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You should leave, child. The town doesn't know what they are, and neither do I. But I can tell you this much, they don't mean us any good." Lena felt a chill creep down her spine, but she wasn't one to back down. Her return to Eldridge had been driven by a need to confront her past. She had spent 10 years away from this place, ever since the strange disappearance of her brother, Noah. He had been obsessed with the lights before he vanished, spending every night staring up at the sky with an intensity that bordered on madness. His disappearance had never been explained. The police had called it a runaway case, but Lena had never believed that. She knew there was something more to it. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Lena started visiting the town's local library, poring through old records and newspapers. The lights were mentioned here and there, but always in vague terms. Sightings, rumors, whispers of something strange lurking in the woods. One evening, as she dug deeper into the town's history, she came across a journal entry written by an early settler of Eldridge. The entry spoke of lights in the sky and strange machines that hover above the trees. It was an odd reference, but it intrigued her. The next night, Lena decided to take a walk into the woods. Armed with only a flashlight, she ventured down the narrow trail that led into the heart of the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She felt a strange pull, an invisible force that seemed to guide her deeper into the trees. Her heart raced as the familiar lights appeared in the distance, flickering just beyond the tree line. This time they were brighter, more intense, and they seemed to be moving toward her. Lena's pulse quickened. She turned to run, but her feet felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding her in place. The lights were getting closer now, swirling in the sky above her, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. It was then that she heard it. A low hum, vibrating through the air, like the sound of 1,000 bees buzzing just out of reach. The lights grew brighter, and for a moment, everything went still. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. Lena stumbled back toward the trail, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced, torn between the need to understand what had happened and the overwhelming fear that something far worse than she could imagine was lurking in the shadows. Lena returned home, shaken by what she had witnessed in the woods. The lights, the hum, the inexplicable pull toward them. It all felt too real to be a figment of her imagination. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in Eldridge was far more sinister than she had ever imagined. She needed to know more, to understand why the lights had been so drawn to her, just as they had drawn Noah away all those years ago. The next day, Lena visited the old church on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, its once beautiful stained glass windows now shattered and its wooden doors warped and splintered by time. Despite its decaying state, the church had a certain presence, something about it that felt out of place, almost as though it were trying to keep a secret. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the faint creak of the building settling in the wind. Lena wandered through the church, her flashlight flickering as she explored the abandoned pews and altar. It was then that she found something strange, a collection of old, yellowed maps piled high in one corner. They were scattered across a long-forgotten desk. Some folded neatly, others torn and crumpled as though they had been rifled through in haste. One of the maps caught her eye. It depicted the town of Eldridge, but with strange symbols and markings that seemed to point toward the woods. At the center of the map was a large black circle with the word beacon scrawled in faded ink. Lena traced the markings with her fingers, her mind racing. Beacon? She whispered to herself. What does it mean? She turned the map over, only to find more notes written in the same frantic handwriting. They're coming again, one note read. They'll take us all if we don't stop them. Her stomach churned as she read the words. What was the town hiding? And what was the connection to the lights in the sky? Determined to find answers, Lena headed back to the woods that evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that the church had been hiding something important, that there was a clue buried there that might explain everything. But when she reached the spot where she had seen the lights, she was greeted by an unsettling silence. The air felt thick, and the trees, once familiar, now seemed to close in on her, as if watching her every move. Suddenly, she heard a crackle from the bushes behind her. Lena spun around, her heart racing. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a shape, barely visible, darting between the trees. It was quick, too quick to be a person. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she backed away, her breath shallow. The figure was getting closer, and there was no mistaking it. It was real. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Only the rustle of leaves and the distant hum that seemed to grow louder by the second. Then, out of the shadows, a man appeared. A figure dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were wild, his hair matted and unkempt, as though he had been lost in the woods for days. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice low and cracked. "It's too late for you, too late for all of us." He took a step toward her, his eyes wide with panic. "The lights, they're coming for you next. You have to leave. You have to get out of this town before they..." His warning was cut short as a blinding light suddenly erupted from the sky, illuminating the woods around them in an eerie, unnatural glow. The hum grew deafening, and for a moment, Lena could only stand there, frozen in fear, as the light enveloped everything in its path. The man screamed, his voice swallowed by the overwhelming brightness. Lena turned to run, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she glanced back, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man was gone, as if he had never been there at all. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the woods in an oppressive silence. Lena's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, breathless and shaken. What had just happened? Had the man been real, or had it all been a hallucination brought on by the terror she felt? As she struggled to make sense of it, Lena realized one terrifying truth. There was something far more dangerous at play here than she had ever imagined. The lights, the strange symbols, the people who had disappeared, all of it was connected. And the town of Eldridge was hiding something dark and twisted, something that would not rest until it had claimed her too. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. Lena couldn't escape the images of the light and the strange man in the woods. She had tried to go about her daily routine, but her mind was constantly haunted by the events she couldn't explain. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that something had changed within her. Something that made her more connected to the town and its dark history than ever before. The lights, the map, the warning, none of it made sense, but it was all leading her towards something, and she had to figure out what before it was too late. Her next step was to confront Mrs. Pembroke. The elderly woman had known more than she was letting on, and Lena needed answers. She made her way to the woman's house, a small cottage at the edge of town, its windows dark and uninviting. When she knocked on the door, it creaked open slowly, as if the house itself were reluctant to reveal its secrets. Mrs. Pembroke was sitting by the fire, her wrinkled hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. Her eyes were clouded with age, but there was a sharpness to them when they landed on Lena. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, the weight of the woman's words sinking in. "I told you to leave, child," Mrs. Pembroke continued. "This town, it's not what it seems. It's been hiding the truth for generations. The lights in the sky, they've always been here, and they always will be. And anyone who gets too close ends up changed." Lena leaned forward, desperate for more information. "What do you mean changed?" she asked. "What happens to them?" Mrs. Pembroke's face contorted in a mixture of fear and sorrow. "They take what they want," she said. "The lights aren't just lights, they're something else, something from another world. And when they find someone they want, they take them, they erase them, and they leave only husks, empty shells of who they were." Lena recoiled, her mind spinning with the horrific implications. "So my brother, Noah, he's not just gone?" "No," Mrs. Pembroke whispered, her eyes filled with regret. "He's still out there somewhere, but he's not the same. None of them are. The lights change them. They take their memories, their souls. They become vessels for something else." She shuddered, as though the very thought of it was too much to bear. Lena's heart clenched in her chest. Her brother had never been the same after his obsession with the lights, but she had always thought it was just a phase, a weird fascination. She never considered the possibility that something darker had been at play. Now the pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was even more terrifying than she had imagined. "How do I stop it?" Lena demanded, her voice rising with urgency. "How do I get him back?" Mrs. Pembroke looked at her with pity, her expression softening. "You can't stop it, child. No one can. The lights will come for you, just like they came for him. And when they do, you'll be just like him, a hollow version of yourself, lost and forgotten." Lena stood up, shaking with fear and determination. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let the same fate claim her brother or herself. There has to be something. There has to be a way to fight back. Mrs. Pembroke hesitated for a moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered book. She placed it in Lena's hands with trembling fingers. "This is the key," she said quietly. "It's an old journal, written by someone who tried to stop them long ago. It's full of cryptic messages and warnings, but there might be something in it that can help you." Her eyes locked with Lena's, filled with both fear and hope. If anyone can stop them, it's you. Lena clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. This was it, the only chance she had to save Noah and herself. She didn't know what the journal contained, but she had to believe that it held the answers. With renewed determination, she turned toward the door, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As she stepped outside, the air seemed to change. The town of Eldridge, once so familiar and comforting, now felt suffocating, like a trap closing in around her. She had no idea what was waiting for her, but she knew one thing for sure: the lights were coming, and she had to be ready. Lena spent the following days obsessing over the journal Mrs. Pembroke had given her. It was filled with cryptic notes and sketches, written in a hand that seemed to tremble with every word. At first, she couldn't make sense of most of it. There were mentions of entities that roamed the skies and a gateway that could only be accessed under the cover of darkness. There were warnings about the townspeople too, many of whom had either been complicit in hiding the truth or were too afraid to speak out. It seemed that no one in Eldridge was truly free of the curse the lights had cast on the town. The most chilling part of the journal was a page marked with a strange symbol, one that looked eerily similar to the markings on the map she had found in the church. Beneath it, in frantic, almost desperate handwriting, it read, "The beacon is their signal. It calls them. And once they hear it, they will come for you. You must destroy it before it destroys you." Lena didn't understand what the beacon was, but she knew it had to be tied to the lights. The more she thought about it, the more the words seemed to pulse with significance. There was something about it that gnawed at her, something buried deep within the town's history that she had yet to uncover. One evening, as dusk began to fall, Lena made her way back to the woods. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to return, but she knew she had to. The journal had mentioned that the beacon would be activated at night, and it was getting darker earlier now. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. There was a sense of urgency growing inside her, the feeling that the town was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her to figure it out before it was too late. When she reached the clearing where she had first seen the lights, she froze. The air felt wrong, thick with something dark and oppressive. The trees, once so familiar, now seemed twisted and alive, their branches reaching out like hands trying to pull her into the shadows. She could feel the hum again, the same low vibration that had shaken her to her core on that first night. Only this time, it was stronger, closer. Without thinking, Lena stepped into the clearing. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt as though something would reveal itself if she just kept moving forward. Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint, glowing light in the sky, hovering just above the tree line. It wasn't the same as the lights she had seen before. This one was stationary, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural glow. It was like a beacon calling out to her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew now that this was it, the beacon. This was what the journal had warned her about. It was the source of the lights, the thing that had been drawing them to Eldridge all these years, the thing that had taken Noah. And if she didn't stop it now, it would take her too. With a surge of adrenaline, Lena ran toward the light, determined to destroy it before it could claim another victim. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to crackle with energy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. She reached the base of an ancient oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, and found something that made her stomach churn. A metal object, half buried in the earth. It was large, almost the size of a small car, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It was the beacon, an otherworldly device, a portal for whatever creatures were waiting to claim the town. As Lena knelt down to examine it, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a pull deep inside her chest, as if the beacon were calling to her, urging her to step closer. But she fought the urge, reaching instead for a rock on the ground. With all her strength, she hurled it at the device, watching in horror as it bounced harmlessly off the surface. The beacon pulsed again, brighter this time, and Lena's heart sank. It was too late. She had waited too long. The lights, the strange machines, they were already here. Suddenly, the sky above her lit up in a blinding flash. The hum reached a crescendo, and for a moment, Lena couldn't hear anything but the deafening roar of it. And then, out of the corner of her eyes, she saw something moving. Figures, shadows in the distance moving toward her. They were tall, humanoid, but not quite human, their limbs elongated and their faces hidden in darkness. Lena screamed, her voice swallowed by the overwhelming noise. The figures closed in around her, and she knew then that she was no longer in control. The lights had found her. They had claimed her. As the darkness closed in, Lena's last thoughts were of Noah, of the town she had once called home, and of the terrible truth that had been buried here for so long. She had tried to fight back, to stop the lights from taking everything she held dear, but in the end, it was too late. Eldridge would never be free.